There is a fundamental assumption we make when we look out over the vast, turbulent expanse of the sea. We assume that the water has always been there. We believe that the deep, dark basins of the world are permanent fixtures of the earth, untouched by human hands and entirely removed from the story of human civilization. We look at the rolling gray waves and see a natural void, a place where history only exists in the form of sunken ships and rusted metal. But the water is not a permanent fixture. The water is a curtain. And in the early 20th century, for a brief, terrifying moment, a man managed to slip behind that curtain and see exactly what the earth was trying to hide. If you examine the maritime logs of the United States government from the late 1930s, you will find mountains of mundane paperwork. You will find records of dredging operations, shipping tonnage, and the tedious mapping of underwater shoals. But if you know exactly where to look within the regional archives of the Great Lakes Maritime Boards, you will find a strange, heavily redacted gap in the files from the autumn of 1937. It is a gap that surrounds a single, highly experienced deep-water diver. This diver did not find a sunken freighter. He did not find a lost cargo of copper or a sunken coal barge. 40 feet beneath the freezing surface of Lake Michigan, this diver found a perfectly preserved, mathematically precise circle of massive standing stones. He documented the coordinates. He sketched the ancient carvings he found etched into the granite. He submitted his findings to the highest regional authorities, believing he had made the greatest archaeological discovery in the history of the North American continent. And within a matter of weeks, his report, his sketches, and his professional reputation were systematically, entirely erased from existence. To understand how a discovery of this magnitude could be buried by the very institutions designed to protect history, we must first understand the absolute isolation and terrifying reality of deep-water diving in the year 1937. This was not the era of modern scuba gear. There were no lightweight carbon fiber tanks, no sleek neoprene wetsuits, and no digital dive computers. In the 1930s, entering the deep water was a brutally mechanical industrial endeavor. The men who did this work wore the Mark V diving dress. It was a suit straight out of a mechanical nightmare. The suit itself was made of heavy waterproofed canvas and vulcanized rubber. The boots were solid lead, weighing 40 pounds to anchor the diver to the lakebed. The chest was fitted with a heavy copper breastplate, and over the diver's head was a massive, spun copper and brass helmet featuring a thick glass viewport and a heavy air valve. Fully suited, a diver carried nearly 200 pounds of extra weight. When a man stepped off the ladder of a salvage barge and sank beneath the surface, he was entirely at the mercy of the men above. His only connection to the living world was a thick rubber umbilical cord that supplied compressed air, pumped furiously by hand-cranked wheels on the deck of the ship. If the men stopped cranking, the diver died. If the hose snagged on a piece of jagged shipwreck, the diver died. It was a profession reserved for men with a profound tolerance for isolation and an absolute lack of claustrophobia. Thomas Langdon was one of these men. Langdon was a veteran of the Great War, a man who had survived the mud and the artillery of the European trenches. He returned to America and found his calling in the dark, silent trenches of the lakebed. By 1937, he was considered one of the premier commercial hard hat divers in the Midwest. He was employed by a regional maritime surveying company, heavily subsidized by federal infrastructure grants. His job was entirely practical. The shipping lanes of the Great Lakes were the industrial arteries of the United States. Freighters carrying iron ore, timber, and coal constantly navigated these waters. But the lakes were notoriously treacherous. Storms could whip up in a matter of minutes, sinking massive freighters and altering the underwater topography. Langdon's job was to descend into the cold dark, locate submerged navigational hazards, identify sunken wrecks, and map the safe channels for the freighters. In late October of 1937, Langdon's salvage barge was positioned over a specific section of Lake Michigan, near the deep, glacially carved basin of Grand Traverse Bay. The local commercial fishermen had been complaining for months. Their heavy, deep-water trawling nets kept snagging on an uncharted obstruction roughly 40 feet below the surface. They assumed it was the mast of a lost schooner or perhaps a dumped load of heavy industrial machinery. The Maritime Board dispatched Langdon's crew to identify the hazard, mark its coordinates, and determine if it needed to be cleared with underwater explosives. The morning of the dive was bitterly cold. The sky over Lake Michigan was a flat, bruised gray. The crew helped Langdon into his heavy canvas suit, bolted the copper breastplate to his chest, and carefully lowered the heavy brass helmet over his head. The locks clicked into place with a definitive, metallic finality. Langdon stepped off the wooden ladder. The water closed over his glass viewport. We must try to imagine the sensory experience of this descent. As Langdon sank through the water column, the ambient light rapidly faded. The water of Grand Traverse Bay is notoriously clear, but in late October, the heavy overcast sky meant that the deep water was plunged into a murky, emerald twilight. The only sound Langdon could hear was the deafening, rhythmic hiss of his own air intake, and the slow, heavy pounding of his own heart. At 40 feet down, his lead boots finally struck the bottom. He sank an inch into the soft, silty sediment of the lakebed. He signaled the surface with 2 sharp pulls on his lifeline, confirming he had touched down. He turned on his heavy, battery-powered underwater lantern, casting a narrow beam of harsh yellow light into the gloom. He expected to see the shattered wooden ribs of a sunken 19th-century schooner. He expected to see a rusted boiler or the skeletal remains of a shipwreck. Instead, his light swept across a massive vertical pillar of solid stone. Langdon walked slowly toward it, fighting the heavy resistance of the water. As he approached, he realized the scale of the object. It was a granite monolith, roughly 5 feet tall. It was not a natural glacial erratic. It was not a random boulder dropped by the melting ice of the ancient past. It was standing perfectly upright. It had been placed. Langdon brushed the thick layers of algae and freshwater sponges from the surface of the stone. He walked around it, and as he panned his lantern to the left, his light caught another pillar, standing exactly the same height, just a few yards away. He walked to the second stone. Then he saw a third. Langdon realized with a rising sense of absolute awe that he was standing on the edge of a massive, perfectly calculated geometric circle. He spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the structure. His air hose trailed behind him in the silt. He counted over a dozen massive stones, arranged in a deliberate, undeniable ring. In the very center of the circle lay a massive, flat slab. The architecture was identical to the prehistoric megaliths of Europe. It was an underwater Stonehenge, sitting in the absolute silence of the American Midwest. But it was what Langdon found on the outermost stone that cemented the discovery as a world-shattering anomaly. Langdon approached a large, slightly angled boulder near the edge of the circle. He noticed deep, unnatural grooves cut into the face of the granite. He pulled a heavy iron scraper from his utility belt and carefully cleared away centuries of aquatic growth. As the gray surface of the stone was revealed, a distinct, undeniable petroglyph emerged in the harsh yellow light of his lantern. It was a carving of an animal. It had a domed head, massive, sweeping tusks, and a heavy, sloping back. It was a mastodon. Langdon stood frozen in his heavy brass helmet, staring at the carved image. He knew that the massive, elephant-like creatures had gone completely extinct in North America over 10,000 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age. The implications hit him with the physical force of a shock wave. For a mastodon to be carved into this stone, the carving had to be made by someone who had seen the animal alive. That meant the carving was at least 10,000 years old. But even more terrifying was the location of the stone itself. The stones were currently sitting 40 feet underwater. But whoever arranged this massive, perfect circle did not build it in the water. They built it on dry land. Langdon realized that he was standing in the flooded ruins of an ancient world. 10,000 years ago, this lakebed was a dry, grassy valley. The people who lived in that valley had possessed the engineering capability to cut, transport, and align stones weighing thousands of pounds. They had built a masterpiece of prehistoric architecture. And then the ice melted. The waters rose. The valley flooded, swallowing the stone circle, preserving it perfectly in the cold, oxygen-deprived depths of the new lake. Langdon was looking at an artifact that entirely shattered the accepted timeline of human history in the Americas. He took his heavy diving knife and carefully measured the dimensions of the carving. He took strict mental notes of the circumference of the circle, the distance between the stones, and the exact compass bearings of the central slab. He signaled the surface, 3 sharp pulls. He was ready to ascend. When Langdon broke the surface and the crew unbolted his heavy copper helmet, he was pale, shivering, and speaking with a frantic, uncharacteristic energy. He ordered the captain of the barge to drop a heavy iron buoy to mark the exact coordinates. He went directly into the small, cramped cabin of the salvage barge. He sat at the wooden desk, his hands still trembling from the cold and the adrenaline, and he began to write. He wrote what would become known as the 1937 Grand Traverse Submerged Anomaly Report. It was a meticulous, highly professional document. Langdon detailed the exact depth soundings. He provided a hand-drawn, scaled map of the stone circle. He documented the dimensions of the pillars and a highly detailed proportional sketch of the mastodon petroglyph. Langdon believed he was about to be a hero. He believed his discovery would trigger the greatest academic expedition in the history of the country. He imagined fleets of Navy divers, massive dredging operations, and the rewriting of the history books. When the barge returned to port in Chicago, Langdon personally delivered the report, complete with his sketches and the authenticated ship's log, to the regional director of the Maritime Board. The director assured him that the report would be forwarded immediately to the Naval Hydrographic Office and the prominent historical authorities in Washington, D.C. Langdon went home to wait for the telegram that would change his life. But the telegram never came. Instead, a week later, 2 men arrived at Langdon's small apartment. They did not wear the uniforms of the Maritime Board. They wore heavy wool suits, and they carried leather briefcases. They introduced themselves as federal inspectors. They sat at Langdon's kitchen table and informed him, with a cold, terrifying politeness, that his report contained significant, unacceptable errors. They told him that the stones he saw were entirely natural. They were simply glacial erratics, random boulders dropped by the retreating ice sheets 10,000 years ago. The circular arrangement was a mere coincidence of nature, a trick of the currents. Langdon protested. He argued that nature does not arrange boulders in a perfect geometric circle. He argued that nature does not raise a central altar slab. The men in the suits remained completely impassive. They then addressed the mastodon carving. They told Langdon that the deep grooves in the granite were simply natural fissures, cracks caused by thermal expansion and glacial scraping. They told him that his exhausted, oxygen-deprived mind had suffered from nitrogen narcosis in the deep water, and he had simply hallucinated the aphos, shape of an animal in the random cracks of a rock. Langdon realized what was happening. This was not a scientific debate. This was an intervention. He stood up and told the men that he would take the story to the newspapers. He told them he would hire his own boat, return to the coordinates, and bring up photographic proof. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. One of the men opened his leather briefcase. He produced Langdon's commercial diving license, his federal work permits, and his WPA employment contracts. The man looked Langdon in the eye and stated a simple, undeniable fact. It was 1937. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Jobs were incredibly scarce. Men were starving in the streets. If Langdon continued to insist on this hallucination, the board would have no choice but to permanently revoke his diving license on the grounds of mental instability. He would never work on the water again. He would be blacklisted from every maritime company from Chicago to New York. Furthermore, the men informed him that the exact coordinates of the site had been classified under a federal navigational hazard mandate. If Langdon attempted to return to the site independently, he would be arrested for interfering with restricted federal waterways. The threat was absolute. They were holding his livelihood, his reputation, and his freedom hostage. Langdon was a brave man, but he was also a practical one. He had a family to feed. He looked at the men, he looked at his diving license on the table, and he slowly nodded. He agreed that he must have been mistaken. He agreed it was just a pile of natural rocks. The men smiled, returned his paperwork, and left the apartment. But they did not leave empty-handed. They had already visited the Maritime Office. They had permanently confiscated the original 1937 report. They had taken the ship's logbook. They had taken the hand-drawn sketches of the Mastodon. By the end of the month, the stone circle under Grand Traverse Bay had been completely, bureaucratically erased from existence. To a modern observer, this level of institutional suppression seems deeply paranoid. Why would the government or the academic establishment care so much about a pile of rocks at the bottom of a lake? Why would they go to such extreme lengths to threaten a diver and bury a report? To understand the motive, we must understand the rigid, unyielding dogma of the historical establishment in the 1930s. During this era, the timeline of North America was strictly, fiercely controlled by institutions like the Smithsonian. The prevailing, undisputed theory of the time was the Clovis First model. The academic elite had built their entire careers, their reputations, and their funding on the premise that human beings had only arrived in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. According to this rigid timeline, these early humans were primitive, disorganized, nomadic hunter-gatherers. They followed the herds. They lived in hide tents. They chipped simple arrowheads. The academic establishment held a deeply Eurocentric view of history. They believed that complex civilization only originated in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and ancient Britain. They actively refused to believe that a highly advanced, organized civilization could have existed on the North American continent. If Langdon's report was allowed to become public, it would completely destroy the established timeline. A Stonehenge-like structure built in the Midwest over 10,000 years ago proved that the inhabitants of Ice Age America were not just primitive nomads. It proved they were master builders. It proved they understood geometry, astronomy, and heavy industrial mechanics. It proved that a sophisticated empire had existed in the American heartland long before the pyramids were even a thought in the minds of the pharaohs. To the men running the museums and the historical boards in 1937, this was not a fascinating discovery. This was a catastrophic threat. In academia, careers are built on consensus. When a piece of physical evidence emerges that shatters the consensus, the institution must make a choice. They must either admit they have been entirely wrong for generations, rewrite millions of textbooks, and publicly humiliate their leading scholars. Or they can simply make the evidence disappear. In 1937, they chose disappearance. It was infinitely easier to threaten a working-class diver and burn a 30-page report than it was to completely restructure the foundation of human history. The suppression was executed flawlessly. Thomas Langdon returned to his job. He mapped the shoals. He raised the sunken barges. He never spoke of the stone circle again, not even to his own crew. When he finally retired in the 1950s, he took the secret with him, a quiet, bitter knowledge locked behind the eyes of an old man who knew exactly what he had seen in the dark. The 1937 report vanished into the deepest, most inaccessible vaults of the National Archives. It was likely misfiled on purpose, stripped of its title, or simply incinerated in a basement furnace. The coordinates were wiped from the hydrographic maps. The lakebed was officially declared empty. For 70 years, the megaliths of Grand Traverse Bay sat in the absolute silence of the deep water, waiting. It wasn't until decades later, in the early 21st century, that modern sonar technology would independently sweep the bottom of the bay and accidentally rediscover the exact same stone circle. When the modern discovery made headlines, it was treated as a completely new, unprecedented revelation. The modern academics marveled at the stones. They debated the timeline. But deeply buried in the local legends of the maritime community, the truth lingered. The modern surveyors were not the first to find the flooded world. They were simply the first ones allowed to talk about it. The story of Thomas Langdon and the vanished 1937 report is a terrifying testament to the power of the archive. It is a reminder that history is not a collection of objective facts. History is a curated museum, managed by gatekeepers who carefully decide which exhibits the public is allowed to see. When we look at the official timeline of human existence, we believe we are seeing a complete, accurate picture. We believe that science and archaeology are purely objective pursuits, driven only by the desire to uncover the truth. But Langdon's story proves that the truth is entirely conditional. The truth is only allowed to exist if it fits neatly into the pre-approved narrative of the era. If a piece of history creates friction, it can be quietly, violently removed from reality. Think about the sheer vulnerability of a historical fact in the early 20th century. There was no internet, there was no digital backup. A discovery only existed on the physical piece of paper it was written on. If you controlled the paper, you controlled the reality of the entire world. How many other divers, how many surveyors, how many local farmers stumbled across the impossible ruins of a forgotten American empire? How many other reports detailing advanced metallurgy, anomalous skeletons, and perfectly engineered ancient architecture were submitted to the authorities, only to be locked in a filing cabinet and never seen again? The deep waters of the world are the ultimate guardians of the past. The cold, oxygen-deprived depths preserve the stones perfectly. The water protects the ruins from the plow and the bulldozer. But the water is not the only barrier. The most impenetrable barrier is the bureaucracy of the state. The ledgers, the stamps, the classified folders, and the institutional silence. We look out over the surface of the Great Lakes today, and we see a vast natural beauty. We watch the freighters move across the horizon, entirely unaware that they are sailing over the roofs of a lost civilization. We trust the history books that tell us the story of human progress is a slow, primitive climb. But beneath the waves, the stones are still standing. The mastodon is still carved into the granite. The evidence of an impossible past refuses to decay, waiting patiently in the emerald twilight for a world brave enough to finally look at it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the vanished report of 1937 was simply a clerical error, a misplaced file in an era of disorganized, chaotic maritime administration. Maybe the men in the wool suits were right, and the stones were simply a remarkable, entirely accidental arrangement of glacial debris that, unfortunately, tricked the oxygen-starved mind of an exhausted diver. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe Thomas Langdon stood in the freezing dark of the lakebed, traced his heavy canvas glove over the carved tusks of a creature that died 10,000 years ago. He realized that the true history of humanity is a terrifying cycle of empires that rise, build, and are inevitably swallowed by the water, leaving nothing behind but a few cold stones that the modern world is completely desperate to ignore.